You know, the New Testament, one of the most used means of teaching, at least in the four accounts of the gospel, would be parables. In fact, one chapter, Matthew chapter 13, is sometimes referred to as the chapter of parables because it really is just one parable after another. Now, each of those parables has a common message about the kingdom of God and its value, but they are different parables, whether the pearl of great price or the coin that's lost or whatever it would be. And we don't really recognize it, but sometimes we actually do a lot of preaching in parables. We don't so much call it that, but we do. We use the word illustration more often than parables. But a parable is really a little bit more than an illustration. A parable is generally a story that's told, and then we try to reach a conclusion at the end of the story. Well, I want to have a lesson this evening that kind of does that. I want to ask the question first, what would an examination of your heart reveal? Now, I'm not talking about the physical blood pump. I'm talking about the essence of your soul and who you are. You know, your heart in the New Testament is referred to as that which dictates and determines every action of your life. And so when you start thinking about the heart, you're really talking about the motivational factor for everything that you do and the way that you live your life. And we're really going to devote ourselves to that idea in just a few moments. But before we do, we're going to try to have kind of a parable. What can we learn by examining an old house? Now, I have one specific old house in mind, and I want to give you my parable this evening upon which this lesson is based. I had a friend in Columbia many years ago who lived on a farm, and his parents had owned a farm that was adjacent to his. And for many years, I didn't realize that there was a house back there, but there was. And it had become so grown up and abandoned over a period of years by the time that I met him that I didn't actually even realize there was a house there until someone told me. Well, it's kind of interesting. His mother was the last to pass away, and she died very suddenly. And when she died, there was some type of a problem within the family, and I don't know exactly what it was, some kind of a disagreement, and they couldn't really decide what to do with the inheritance. And so even though the house had gotten such a shape that you couldn't even tell it was there anymore by the time that I knew him, this thing came to a head, and I don't know how many years later that was, and they finally settled the inheritance, but that was many, many, many years after the death of his mother. But the interesting thing is that when she died, they just shut the door. Now, I never went up there, but I had people to tell me that there was actually plates sitting on the table. She must have died during a meal preparation that actually still had food on them, the same food that she had dipped that day, such as it would have been then. There was actually a pack of crackers sitting on the table that was still there. Everything was just like she left it. They came in, removed the body, and shut the door, and they didn't do anything. And it just remained that way for all those years. Well, I never had an opportunity to go up there, but that would have been kind of interesting to have done. Pat and I, some years ago, went up to her grandfather's old home site. And by that time, it was in a pretty sad state of repair. And one of the things that we found very interesting was the canceled checks that were blown around the yard. Now, the canceled checks were very interesting because some of them would be for $1 at co-op. I mean, it was just interesting to read them and see that some of them would be for less than $1 to buy peanuts. I mean, it was just interesting to look at, but it tells you a lot about the person when you begin to examine that kind of artifacts, if you want to use that language. Well, you think about this situation. This house was left just like it was the day of his mother's death. And you know, you could have gone there and you could tell a lot about the people that lived there just by going around the house and kind of snooping around a little bit and looking at all the things that were there, the things that were hung on the wall. And knowing her and how religious she was, I suspect there were a lot of things hung on the wall that would reflect her faith. And I believe that you could have told a lot about the people that lived there just by examining the house. Well, you stop and you think about that, and you kind of give some consideration to it. It's kind of like us. You know, we live, our heart is really representative of our soul. And our soul actually lives in a house. This body that I possess and the body that you possess is actually the house that you live in. That's what it is. This body is not me, and your body is not you. But your body is actually the dwelling place, and it's referred to as that in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. It is the house that you live in. So when you begin to examine the heart, you would learn a lot about the persons who lived in that house just by kind of examining the things that you would see there. Well, let's kind of think about this. One of the things that I would ask would be, would God's laws be written there? That is, on your heart. You know, a lot of people don't realize that when you think about the New Testament and the Old Testament, people talk about how different they are, and they are. But they're different deliberately, and they have a direct connection. One of the things that you see in the Old Testament is the preparation that's made for your understanding of the New. And you go back to the Old Testament and you find that when God gave the original 10 Commandments, He wrote them on tables of stone. Now, that's pretty impressive. Not long ago, we took a second trip out west, and I saw something that I do not remember seeing the first time. When you go up to Mount Rushmore, there are these pillars that are erected there, and they're really just decorative pillars. They don't serve any great purpose, but I don't know that I ever knew until this trip what they are. What they are is on each one of them there is a plaque, and that plaque has the name of a state, and I believe that it has the date of its admission to the Union. So there are 50 of those plaques there, 50 of those pillars, and each of them has a plaque. And the whole point of that is to tell you about these states. But then I got to thinking about that when I was looking at them. Now that's kind of amazing, I guess. But what do you know about those states? Because New York, New Jersey, Hawaii, and Tennessee, all their plaques looked exactly alike except for the lettering on them. So what do you learn about the states by looking at those pillars? Well, you don't really learn anything about them. But if you were to begin to examine the people that live in those states, you would learn a lot about the conduct of the state itself and the values that it reflects to the world. That's kind of like it is with the tables of stone. When God gave the 10 Commandments, and you can read them, of course, in Exodus chapter 20, when He gave them to Moses and he came down the mount with them, of course, He broke the first ones, and then He had to go back and get a second set later. And He actually had to chisel the second ones, I believe, the stone, then God wrote on them. But at any rate, what you see there is just tables of stone. Now that would be amazing to see, wouldn't it? It'd be amazing to see those tables of stone that God wrote. I think the language that's used in the later is that God wrote them with His finger. I believe is the way that it's expressed. And you think, well, what a marvelous thing. But what do they really accomplish? I mean, what about them do you learn? You say, well, I know that thou shalt not steal, for example. Well, I understand that. But I tell you something, God seems to think, by His own statement, that they were a little bit lacking a little, that they really didn't do what needed to be done. And I'll tell you how I know that. Because Jeremiah 31 says, in verse 31 beginning, Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, with the house of Jacob, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the way that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel, and after those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember them their sin no more. Well, notice what he's saying. Do you know what they did with those first tables of stone that God had recorded the Ten Commandments on? You remember what they did with them? They put them in the Ark of the Covenant. Do you remember where the Ark of the Covenant was? It was in the most holy place. Do you remember how many people ever even saw the Ark of the Covenant, much less the tables of stone? Only one man in every generation. And how many times did he see it? Once a year. And that's it. Now you think of that. God wrote them, and how impressive that is, but they were in a box, in a room that was completely private and sealed off, and no one entered it but one person once a year. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? But when you look at the laws of God in the present time, what did he say? They're written in the hearts of men. In the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 3, when it goes back and refers to that, I want you to look at the way it's recorded here in verse 2 and 3. Paul said, "Ye are our epistles, written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as ye are manifestly declared to be the epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart." Now you think of that statement in connection with those first tables and the tables that are there now, that are actually written in your heart. Now you think about that. When God gave the original Ten Commandments, He wrote them on tables of stone. But He Himself says that that was not nearly so impressive as the heart that's written in the hearts, or the law that's written in the hearts of all men. And it's not written on tables of stone, but it's written in fleshly tables of the heart. But let me tell you something. Until the laws of God are written on our hearts, and how are they written on our hearts? You know, if you were going back and you were trying to discover something about someone, what's important to them, you would discover pretty quickly by just looking at the way they decorated their house and the things that they had in their house and the places that were put in a position of prominence. It's kind of like this. If your kitchen is like ours, you have some things that you use every day. They're very accessible in a place that you can very easily get to them, and you use them constantly. You probably have some things that you don't use very often. And when you do, you have a hard time getting to them. So if I came to your house, I could pretty much tell what was important to you in your kitchen just by looking by what was accessible. And when I found something that was hidden in the back of the cabinet, I'd figure out, you didn't use that much. That's something you didn't really consider to be very important. You kind of relegated it to the back of the cabinet where it had all kinds of things packed on it, stacked on it, so that really if your kids ever washed your dishes and they got through and taken it out of the dishwasher and they turned and said, "Mama, where did I put this?" Because they don't know. Because it's never been used before. Well, that's kind of the way it is when you think about your heart. The tables of stone had no real impact upon the people because it was not recorded on their heart, and that was the problem. I want you to go over to Hebrews chapter 3, and it's a pretty long reading, but it's an interesting reading, and it's talking about when God gave those tables of stone and how the people reacted to it and what was wrong with their reaction and how it ought to be different. And you look to Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12, and he said, "Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God." Now understand that he's talking about a nation of people that had a box, and within that box were the laws that God had recorded for them. That's who he's talking about. They had the laws there. "But exhort one another daily while it's called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we are made partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end. While it is said today, if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation." Listen to what these people did. "For some, when they had heard, did provoke. Howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was He grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware He that they should not enter into His rest, but to them that believe not? Did they have the law? Yeah, they were written on the tables of stone. They were in that box, in that innermost part of the tabernacle. But these people had not caused them to be written on their hearts, and therefore they had no real impact on their lives. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. But then in chapter 4, let us therefore fear, lest the promise being left to us of entering into His rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. For we which have believed do enter into rest, as He said, as I have sworn in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For He spake in a certain place the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all His work. In this place, if they shall not enter into my rest. Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in because of unbelief. Again He limiteth a certain day, saying in David, Today after so long a time as it has been said, Today if you will hear His voice, harden not your hearts. First Jesus, and this is Joshua. If Joshua had given them rest, then we did not afterward have spoken of another day. They remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that has entered into His rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from His. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. Now you think about what he's saying, and I realize that it is a flowery type of language that takes a little following, and you may not catch every detail, but I tell you what you catch very quickly. That if you went back and examined their hearts, there would be a serious problem. Their life would not show that God's laws were written there. Now that's the facts. Just like you go back to an old house, you can learn a lot about people. You go back to the life of these people and you examine it and you see the laws weren't written in their hearts. They had them written in a box. We have them in a book. They're there. But that's not the question. The question is not, do you have a Bible in your possession that has the entire mind of God recorded therein? The question is, have you caused it to be written on your heart? Well, how do you cause it to be written on your heart? By obedience. If you don't obey it. I mean, you look back to the Old Testament and you examine the book of Judges where those people went out and built idols and worshipped in their own houses and paid their own priest in opposition to the priesthood of God. Well, it's obvious the law of God wasn't written on their hearts. They had it, but it wasn't written on their hearts. We need to understand that when you begin to think about a demonstration of who you are, if you're claiming to be a Christian, God says the law has to be written in your hearts. And the only way that can be done is by obedience to His truth. If you're not obedient to it, then it's not written there. Any more than these people who had the law in a box, they weren't obedient to it. Just because you have the law in a book, you're not obedient to it either, unless you simply have made it a part of your life. And I think that's really something that's very important. Just think about what you would learn from an old house about those people, if you could examine it. And just think, when someone were to come back, if they could symbolically go back and examine your heart, they can learn a lot about you too, by just looking at what was written there. Well, the second question would be this: would there be an evidence that God had been dwelling there? Now, I say that because in Acts chapter 17, when Paul was preaching in the city of Athens, and we've talked about this a lot, and this is a very familiar passage you've heard many times. He says in this particular place, at verse 12, it's not verse 12, it's actually down in, when he begins in verse 22, where Paul said that God is not worshipped with men's hands. And in verse 24, 12 is pretty close, just double it and you have 24. God that hath made the world and all things therein, seeing that He is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands. Now think about it. He doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. Have you ever thought about how that people today, if you ride by a place and there are a group of Christians that are renting a building down, well, I've preached for a congregation, for example, that was in an old funeral home, And when people would ride by and they would see the wording there, the Court Square Church of Christ, they kind of look down their noses. Well, they don't even have a place of worship. Does that really matter? Is God worshipped in a temple made with hands? You know, St. Peter's Basilica, without question, is the most elaborate center of worship, claiming to be worshipers of Christ in the world. No question about that. Does that really mean that God is being worshipped there in an appropriate fashion? Understand what he said. He said God is not worshipped in temples made with hands. He doesn't dwell there. God doesn't dwell in those temples. We can't, you know, sometimes it's like we think we can build a building almost like the old movie, The Field of Dreams, where the famous line was, if you build it, they will come. And people kind of feel like, well, you know, if I build this building, God will dwell there. Well, that's not true. That's not going to assure that God will dwell there. He doesn't need. Understand, when you think about building a temple for God to dwell in, God built the whole universe, and He dwells in it. And He doesn't need our temple. And we need to kind of keep that in perspective. But let's think about this. Where does God choose to dwell? You know, there's an old saying when people talk about certain people or certain animals, and they say, well, what does so-and-so do? Well, he's a big, strong, muscular guy, and he terrorizes everyone that's around, and they will say he does whatever he wants to do. So if I ask you the question, where does God dwell? God dwells wherever God wants to dwell. God created the universe and everything in it, so He can dwell wherever He pleases. There's no one that can match His power. Well, where does He choose to dwell? What is the place of choice? In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, in verse 16 and 17, the Apostle Paul said, know ye not that ye, he's talking about the church there in Corinth, and I would talk to you, the church here at Berea, know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? Now notice how that puts a great burden of responsibility upon you. If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are. Now think about it. Think about what he's saying. God chooses to dwell within the hearts of His people. That's where He chooses to dwell. That's His choice. Now, Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 14 through verse 19 very similarly says that God dwells in the hearts of men. That he says in verse 17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with, and notice what he says again, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. Well, let's think about that for a moment. You ever heard someone say, if they go to someone's house and they walk out and they leave, and they say, man, I wouldn't live there. Or they'd say, if I lived there, there'd have to be some changes made. It's not an uncommon statement to hear. Well, what do you think about God dwelling in the hearts of His people? Don't you think there has to be some preparation? That God is not going to live in a temple that's not acclimated to Him? God's not going to remain there. You look at James 4 and you think about what he says. He says, ye adulterers, and look at his language. Ye adulterers and adulteresses. So he wants to include men and women both in this thing. Know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. Do you think that the Scripture saith in vain, the Spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? Now, a lot of people don't understand what that means, but I'll tell you what it means. It means that God's not going to dwell in a place that He's not the sole occupant. Now, that's what it means. It means He's not going to dwell in a place He's not the sole occupant. That if you think you're going to bring God in there and let Him dwell there, and you're going to bring Satan in and let him dwell there at the same time, that's not going to happen. But He giveth more grace, wherefore He saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and He will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, and purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Purify your hearts. Most women, I would guess, the women that I've been acquainted with at least, have a almost obsessive idea of what the house needs to be like when they have company, especially if somebody's coming to spend the night or spend a week. I mean, they just really fret themselves about that, spend a great deal of time in cleaning and make sure everything is as perfect as they can make it, and just get irritated if it's not. Now, that's pretty typical. Let me ask you a question. God dwells in you as a Christian. Is that the way you are about the house that you're inviting God to dwell in? That you're trying to make it as hospitable to God as it possibly can be? If a person is coming to my house and I knew that the person had cat allergies, I'd have to make some arrangements. And I would. If they were coming to dwell there, I'd have to do something. So they got a cat that lives there and lives in the house. So I had to make some arrangements. If you think God's going to live in your house and you're going to have Satan living there at the same time, it's not going to happen. And that's the point that you need to realize. Now, when you go and examine an old house, you can tell the kind of people that live there. You can kind of tell the people that were allowed to be a part of it. We remodeled a house one time for a couple. I won't tell you who it is, but because you might know who owned the house to begin with, and I don't want to insult them. But we remodeled the house for them, and they told me that when they remodeled the house, when they bought the house, before they had us to come out, they'd done some previous work before we came, that they took, and I don't remember the number of loads they said. I think they said 3. 3 pickup loads of beer cans out of the house that had just evidently. We used to have some neighbors that lived beside us in Florida, and they were heavy drinkers, and all they ever drank was Budweiser, I reckon. That's all I ever saw. And every time they would get through, evidently they just set the can down beside the couch until it became an enormous pile, because if you went and visited them, they'd just be a big pile. It wouldn't be an end table, just be beer cans stacked up about this high beside the couch. Well, you tell a lot about folks, can't you? You can tell a lot about who lives there by looking at the house. Understand what kind of temple God wants to occupy, and what you're going to have to do to make sure that your body, which is where He chooses to dwell, is in harmony with His wishes. Or else He's going to say, no, I think not. I'm not going to dwell there. Will your life show that God had lived there? When you die, could people go back and see, in a symbolic way, kind of do a little excavation and say, hey, God lived here. God dwelled here. Just think about that. And the last point's this. Would there be evidence that your heart had been guarded? That's an interesting point. If your heart been guarded, there's some language in the Old Testament that's really interesting to me in the book of Proverbs chapter 4. Proverbs 4 and verse 23. We need to remember that bad things must be kept out of our heart. Nathan Haynes planted a garden. Nathan's lived on a farm his whole life. He lived in this part of the country his whole life, and he realizes that deer around here are about as common as fleas. And I kept saying when he was planting that garden, I said, does he not realize the deer are going to eat that whole thing up? That there's just not going to be much come out of it because the deer are going to eat it. And Pat was talking to him about that this morning. He said, I reckon I'm going to have to build me a fence around it. Well, I guess he's right. You're going to have to build a fence around your heart. You have to guard your heart. You have to pay some attention to it. The language in the King James says, keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. But some translations actually say, guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. You think about it. If you don't guard your heart, and you just allow anything and everything in it, the sad state of affairs that's going to occur. You know, you may remember that on the Waltons they had a fellow, and I'm trying to recall his name, and I'm sure you can recall it. But he was the friend of the family. And if you remember, his name was Yancey. Yancey Tucker, I believe, was his name. And if you remember his house, you remember? He had a bunch of chickens. You know where they lived? They lived in the house. He had a bunch of pigs. You remember where they lived? They lived in the house. He had a cow. You know where he lived? Lived in the house. Now, what do you think his house looked like? What do you think it smelled like? You think it'd be a place that you want to go? I mean, you have to realize that all of us guard our houses against certain things, whether it's mice or spiders, or some of you don't like dogs and cats and you don't allow any of those in the house. Some of you do, but some of you don't. But the point is that we guard our house, and we realize that it makes a significant difference about whether it's going to be a place that's inhabitable and hospitable. Well, your heart's the same way. If you don't keep bad things out of your heart, then bad things are going to happen in your life. People who feed on bad things, just remember this, that keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. You're going to act like the things that you take into your heart. Whatever it is that you take into your heart and you allow to be in there, that's what you're going to be like. Now, there's no way to get around that. I sometimes hear people at funerals and all of this, and they say things about folks that don't really reflect their life, and I'm thinking, you know, that's not what they value. What do you value in life? You know, David realized something. And sometimes people don't realize the context of something that's written either. The 51st Psalm there is a heading to it. It's one of the Psalms that has a heading that actually describes when it was written. It's a Psalm of David, and he wrote it when Nathan the prophet came into him after he had gone into Bathsheba. And everybody realizes what happened with Bathsheba, I would suppose. And if you look at chapter 51 and verse 10, when David is trying to clean up the mess that he's made, he says to God, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." You know what got David in trouble? Well, you could argue that he was a king and should have been out with his men, and that might be one of the arguments, and maybe that's true and maybe that's not. But I tell you what I do know. I know that when he's up there on the rooftop and he looks down and sees a woman taking a bath, that he's got a choice to make about what he's going to do with that sight. He can either stand there and gawk at it and make plans based upon it, or he can say, "Boy, I don't need to be a part of this. I'm going somewhere else." Now, that's two things he could do. He must have understood that, because he told God. He said, "Create in me a new clean heart." I didn't have a clean heart, didn't do the right thing. And he said, "Renew a right spirit within me." My spirit was not correct. You know, do you need a clean heart if God's going to dwell in your body? A clean heart does not come from a haphazard approach. And that's something that most people kind of fail to realize. We kind of think that we can just kind of haphazardly do things. You know, I've been building houses a long, long time. And I've been around some people who build like this. And it's especially people who kind of build their own house and they don't really know much about what they're doing. And so what will happen is they'll start working over here on something, and they get to a certain point and they just quit, and then they start some other project, and then they work on that a while, and then they just quit, and then they start some other project and they work on that for a while, and then they just quit. And before long, they have a total disaster. Because that's not the way it works. You know, if you're going to build a house, I'm going to tell you what you do. You go build the foundation, you call the building inspector, he comes and inspects that part of the project. You do the framing, you call the building inspector, he comes and inspects that part of the project. And you know what he signs on that note? He'll put a note on that foundation, say, "Ready to frame." Because now you're ready to proceed. It's not a haphazard, hit and miss approach. A lot of people kind of think a clean heart comes from a haphazard approach. We'll just kind of try, but not get too excited. about service to God. When Jesus was asked that famous question, and He gave that famous answer in Matthew 22, it's so meaningful. And people just kind of, we've read it so much, we take it for granted, we don't even pay attention to what He said. When He was asked which is the great commandment of the law, the first part of that answer was this: Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. That's the first thing He said. With all thy soul, with all thy mind. It's not a haphazard approach. This is something you're devoted to. You're going to see it through to the end. Hebrews 11 and 6, another famous passage. And a lot of times we don't pay attention to what it says. We kind of know that it's talking about faith. Without faith it's impossible to please God. There are two things stated there. You must believe that He is, and that He is the rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. That means it's not a haphazard approach. It's not just you kind of fall into it. You know, when you go out and look at a house when it's completed, or it's supposed to be completed, sometimes you can kind of tell the difference in someone took a haphazard approach and someone who was really devoted and paid some attention to the detail. You tell a big difference. When you look at a person's life, you can tell a big difference as to whether they really valued their relationship with God or whether they didn't. Is there evidence that your heart had been guarded? Will your life show that you've guarded your heart? Do you? Now, we need to really be careful. We need to understand that when we look at our lives, they're kind of like a house. And our life, people look at it, if they could examine it like examining an old house that had been abandoned by someone, when this life is over, if they could go back and kind of examine our life like examining an old house, they could tell a lot about you. Tell a lot about you. What would it say? It's an interesting thing to think about. What would it say? We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you've never obeyed the gospel, we've not had a first principle lesson, but I see all familiar faces. If you need to repent, be baptized from remission of sins, we certainly give you that opportunity. But if you've not lived your life in accord with the will of God and you need to make some corrections, maybe the law of God's not written in your heart, and maybe you've not prepared your life for God to dwell there, and maybe you don't guard your heart as you ought to. Maybe that there's some kind of a public correction that needs to be made, but you know what? It may be that there's a private, just simply to say to yourself, you know what, it hadn't been what it ought to be. Not a public thing, just not as devoted, and I'm going to change that. So whatever the need may be, we encourage you to think about it together. We stand as we sing.